Civil War over. Wait a minute. Alright, they never stopped fighting. Specifically over the island of Kinmen, so the PRC can crush the ROC once and for all. The plan was to take the island by launching an invasion from nearby Xiamen to establish a beachhead and then flooding it to overwhelm the nationalists, who couldn't have more than a token force on the island given their defeats on the mainland, right? They were, of course, very wrong, predicting 12k troops but actually meeting 40k entrenched troops, many veterans against the Japanese in Burma, a lot more than their 19k communist forces of the PLA. Funnily enough, the nationalists got themselves first, triggering one of their own landmines, which alerted the KMT forces and spoiled the PLA's surprise attack. A 3-day battle ensued, with the PLA meeting ROC armor, flamethrowers, indirect fire support, and being under-equipped to deal with the nationalist forces. Well, the major meat grinder would be the village of Qingtao, where bloody street-to-street fighting would ensue, seeing the ROC Air Force providing air support for the nationalist ground troops. In the end, the KMT stood victorious, capturing or killing all the troops that landed on Kinmen. Of course, this was not the rule across the board, as Hainan, the Wanshan Islands, and Zhoushan Islands were all captured by the People Liberation Army. There were also KMT holdouts in Burma and Thailand who would launch guerrilla operations into Yunnan under the General Li Mi. They would continue to fight the PLA until 1953, when the Burmese military would be favored as the bulwark against the PA pushing into Southeast Asia and India. This would see Li Mi disband the army, but many remained, receiving support from the nationalists every once in a while from the air. Also, the peaceful liberation of Tibet occurred in 1949, which compared to the Civil War was less bloody, but definitely not peaceful to say the least. This resulted in the annexation of Tibet and some autonomy, at least for a while, but the Tibetans weren't certainly happy, as seen in the 1959 Tibetan uprising, which would be crushed and the Dalai Lama flee to India, where he remains in exile until this day. While this was going on, the PRC, seeing the capitalist West and South Korean forces pushing a little too close to the Manchurian border, Zhou Enlai makes another appearance, stating that Korea is China's neighbor and they were concerned with the answer to the Korean question. Funnily enough, Stalin did not want the Chinese to intervene, but changed his mind when the UN crossed the 38th parallel. Of course, this was delegated to the Chinese alone, as the Soviets were busy elsewhere. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung was screaming for help as the cavalry would arrive on the 19th of October. Further pushing the Soviets, the Chinese would get the promise of Soviet equipment and an air force over Chinese airspace only, which arrived only after March 1951, and only in small quantities. This would change with the first phase offensive of the Chinese, routing the Republic of Korea and US forces, with the help of the Soviet air volunteers. With the ambush of the UN forces during their Home by Christmas offensive and the resulting second phase offensive by the PLA, the UN forces withdrew to about the 38th parallel. Things would only get worse for the UN during the third phase offensive, seeing many encirclements of UN forces and gains for the North Koreans. This would prompt MacArthur to try to set a dangerous precedent with the suggestion of nuking the Chinese and/or the North Koreans to decimate and irradiate supply chains. This was seen as an extreme solution, and was eventually dismissed as Supreme Commander in Korea, among other reasons such as wanting to invade mainland China. Truman did not really like this idea. After 2 more Chinese offensives and a UN counteroffensive, the war became a stalemate with bloody battles for little game being fought. This would all end with an armistice which allowed the repatriation of dead and captured soldiers. With that mess over with, it is time for internal policy in the PRC. First on the chopping block was the former landlords and businessmen, returning the land ownership system on its head and giving the land to the poorest and landless peasants, which did help them out respectively. Of course, during this process, over 1 million landlords were put to death, and many more, including well-off peasants, were left homeless or fled altogether. Being ever contradictory, in 1957 Mao would launch the anti-rightist campaign, which was in response to his 100 Flowers campaign, which was the liberalization campaign. Seeing as this didn't sit well with Mao, the new campaign would take on the ambiguous task of purging the rightists from the state, the majority being those who criticized the state in some way or were perceived to. It got to the point that Mao himself said not to kill too many people, as the people will lose faith in the government and there would be a shortage of workers, for focusing on what counts. Speaking of needless deaths, it's time for the Great Leap Forward. Mao's plan to rapidly collectivize and industrialize the rural areas of the country. This involved increasing the production of steel and grain. For the latter, there was use of communal backyard furnaces in urbanized areas to produce steel from scrap provided willingly and unwillingly from the peasants' possessions. This would not result in high-quality steel as Mao had hoped, instead producing pig iron that served little to no purpose. After realizing how to actually produce good steel, the program was put down quietly like the family dog in 1959. As far as grain goes, the peasants now living community were essentially made to follow former Soviet agricultural policies, which actually led to lower crop yields in the end. Who could have predicted? Then there was the famine and locust problem. Oh wait, did I not mention the locust swarms? These were caused by the Wonderful Four Pests campaign, which targeted rats, flies, mosquitoes, and most importantly, sparrows, last being the locust's natural predator. This famine was severe, but due to the inflated production numbers and the exportation of grain, it was not getting better anytime soon. The worst of it was in the countryside, though the cities were not spared from reduced rations. There were even cases of cannibalism in the portions of the country which were most infected, and clay and tree bark were hot commodities. In the end, through man's own folly, anywhere from 15 million to 55 million peoples perished in the famine. On the bright side, industrial output had doubled. Silver linings, right? Right? Well on to our way into the 60s, we would see the Four Cleanups movement, which saw many party purges, but this was only the beginning. After a meeting of the Politburo, which solidified the justification of the previous purges and made a new plan where the traitors would be purged through the understanding of Mao Zedong thought, essentially fall in line or get crushed. With the purge of Pangzhen, students would organize into protests which were in favor of Mao, but the party was split over whether the work teams, groups sent to maintain order and control of the CCP, role in whether the students were allowed to radicalize. The two teams were Mao and Lin Shikai, with Mao taking the win and allowing the students to lead the mess themselves. This led to the political death of Liu Shikai and later his torture and death by the CCP. This also saw the creation of the Red Guard, taking those students and turning themselves into paramilitaries. Yay! Mao sanctioned the acts of open rebellion against the bourgeoisie elites in the CCP and government. Having stirred up the hornet's nest in his favor, Mao reorganized the party and government in his full favor. This also saw the propaganda department of the party shuffled out and refreshed with the cultural revolutionary groups, Mao's ideological crusaders. We also saw success in the propagation of the Little Red Book, essentially Mao's manifesto. Speaking of blind zealotry, the Red August of Beijing happened, where the Red Guard from all around the nation gathered to hopefully meet Mao himself. Mao would fraternize with his followers. This fan meetup would lead to the paramilitary starting a wave of terror and murder across the nation. It got to a point where the police were told not to interfere with Red Guard activities, and any who opposed were subject to the violence. Then there was the destruction of the Four Olds, which saw the vandalization of many religious and historical sites. Things would really heat up with Mao's dubbed all-around civil war, where he would attempt to get the PLA officers to back the Red Guard and by extension him against the moderates in the party. The military for the most part worked against the Red Guard, as they had no debt to the radicals, so it's not stopped the many Duoquan groups from taking power from the ruling establishment. Of course, the military is not a homogeneous entity, and whether these uprisings succeeded depended on whether the PLA supported them or not. Of course, this would lead to violence, especially when the paramilitaries got access to weapons. Mao, getting paranoid and probably seeing the writing on the wall, had the Red Guard factions disassembled after the PLA fully turned against them. He would send many of them to the countryside to gain first-hand experience of being a peasant, which many of the former Red Guard enjoyed and approved of. This was also a great ploy to keep them away from the cities and causing more troubles. Mangoes. Yes, mangoes. What do they mean? I'm serious. They hold a significance in these videos in Chinese history. All began with the gift from a former minister of Pakistan in 1968, 40 mangoes. Mao would give some to his propaganda teams who would go on and run with it as a gift from the gods, with a quote from an article, They cried out enthusiastically and sang with wild abandonment. Tears swelled up in their eyes, and they again and again sincerely wished that their most beloved great leader lived 10,000 years without bounds. Yeah. Mangoes became a bit of a symbol in the country for his support of his underlings. Of course, nothing is without bloodshed, as the dentist was humiliated and executed for insulting a mango. Lin Biao would be deemed to be Mao's successor in 1969, would bungle his way by upsetting Mao by mobilizing the PLA when war with the Soviets seemed imminent. Did I also mention they both had nukes by this point? Chinese having less, obviously. This led to a greater rift between the army and the civilian establishment, which would result in the plotted coup by Lin's son and military officials, which Lin Biao may have had no involvement with. According to the CCP, the conspirators sought to flee to the USSR by plane, which crashed into Mongolia in 1971, killing all on board. Mao's mental well-being declined after the death of Bao, seeing him seclude himself from the public. In this depressed state, he would look for guidance from his old friends from the past, also leading to the formation of the Gang of Four, whom fought Zhao Enlai, one of the few remaining moderates in the party structure. Zhao was attempting to stabilize the economy, as the previous purges have left a lot of seats open. Zhao would become busy with his bladder cancer, and the torch of reason in the party was passed to Deng Xiaoping. He would be rehabilitated and fall into Mao's favor as the Gang of Four fell out. Deng's policy was to promote party unity and stop the endless division and revitalize the economy to boot. Of course, after the revolutionary, Mao had worried that Deng would point out the flaws in the Cultural Revolution and would sow the seeds for Deng to be outed as a rightist again, and he would have to repent in self-criticisms. Zhao Enlai, our old friend, would pass away from bladder cancer on January 8th, 1976. His funeral would see the attendance of all the nation's major leaders, excluding Mao, with a eulogy by Deng. Mao would proceed to elevate Huo Guanfeng as his new successor, spiting Deng and the Gang of Four. Also in 1976 would see the Tiananmen incident. No, not that one. That's too close to modern day for me. This incident would start with the mass formation of a commemoration of Zhao Enlai. Over 2 million people assembled there and proceeded to attack the Gang of Four, and even Mao himself. This led the Gang of Four to sic the police on them, leading many as a path to prison. Deng was blamed for the incident and purged again. But hell, at least he was alive. Speaking of alive, Mao was not on September 9, 1976, supposedly writing to Huo Guofeng, "With you in charge, I'm at ease." He would proceed to arrest the Gang of Four, who would be sentenced to prison, or one would commit suicide, another would die in prison, and the remaining two would be released from prison and proceed to die powerless in 2005. The revolutionary of revolutionaries was dead, and what of his legacy? How would the PRC survive without their founding father? Well, that's a story for another day and another channel, as with the death of Mao, this channel's chapter on China has come to an end. Wait, aren't we forgetting something? Oh right, there still remains of the ROC. Well, here we go, I guess. Flashing back to 1947, there was a new incident, which, no surprise, as what is China without incidents? This incident would become known as the February 28th incident, or massacre, depending who you ask. It featured an anti-Kuomintang ROC uprising that was born from the spark of a beating of a widow who was selling contraband cigarettes. This led to the crowd reacting and being shot at by officers. The NRA was called in to suppress the revolts, killing 18,000, and martial law was declared, which would last the next 38 years, and the White Terror would begin. This is where any political dissidents and common citizens were repressed, and many even executed if they had a hint of communism was detected, or a threat to the state. White Terror was also see a heavily monitoring of people's lives through networks and general authoritarian monitoring. The establishment of Chiang's state was one based on fear, terror, and control. Democratic elements in the country were outlawed, with the KMT ruling its one-party state, having fraudulent elections merely for show where the opponents were often sent into exile. Many critics who were established outside the country would turn up dead when visiting the country or even outside of it. In a total, upwards of 4,000 human lives were extinguished, and a conservative estimate of 140,000 were arrested and thrown in jail. It was time to build a nation across the straits. Oh wait, that whole Civil War thing has never really ended, as both sides still claim the mantle of China. With the outbreak of the Korean War, there was a general wake-up call to the USA that the spread of communism in East Asia, and they would move a fleet from the Philippines to the Taiwan Strait as a general, "Don't think about it, Chief." There was a major change in policy, however, when Eisenhower was elected into office, as he went towards the improvement of Chiang's military and infrastructure on the island as a bulwark and convenient airbase against communism in East Asia. It would also reinforce the Penghu Islands, as well as their bases on the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, which lay right on the doorstep of the mainland. This reinforcement was also hopefully in Chiang's mind to pursue the pipe dream of reclaiming the mainland. Stalin had just died, and he figured the USR would not get involved if the US helped them reinvade the mainland, right? Right? The first Taiwan Strait crisis would begin due to the fused islands, specifically Kinmen and the Matsu Islands. The PLA would start by shelling the islands with artillery, an attempt to soften the islands and gain a springboard for a full-on invasion of Taiwan before the ROC could join a proposed US-backed NATO, also spelled NEATO, which would comprise Japan, the US, South Korea, and the ROC. The US will hold back their forces as their focus was on the Penghu Islands and Taiwan as a whole. Situations would change when the PRC began bombarding the Taiso Islands, which would change things with the US and ROC signing the Formosa Resolution and the Sino-American Defense Treaty, essentially guaranteeing all ROC lands. Really, the US would only stick their neck out for the Penghu and Taiwan itself. Eisenhower's administration would go full-on MacArthur and threaten the use of nuclear weapons on the Chinese if the situation escalated. That said, by the time the PRC had gained the Yangshan Islands from the ROC through invasion, the US would strongly recommend that Chiang leave the Dachin Islands, which he begrudgingly did. So, peace, right? Well, you guessed correct. No. In 1958, the second Taiwan Strait crisis would begin when the PRC would begin shelling the Matsu and Kinmen Islands again and attempt some landings, which would be intercepted by the ROC Navy, then the US Navy, and Air Force rolled up, and the PLA was repelled. Way back on the mainland, there was also the KMT Loyalist guerrillas causing a mess in the Western Territories, largely separate from the main forces and isolated, such as those continuing the fight in the Islamic insurgency on the mainland, which were mostly KMT Loyalist Hui, Salar, and Uyghurs, where both sides saw horrible losses and many KMT Loyalists and leaders executed. They would be crushed and the PLA victorious, though there was still much unrest in Xinjiang to this day, or as Deng Xiaoping would put the region, is unsteady. That's one way of putting it, to say, folks. On the economic side of things, the island would flourish as the industry, becoming one of the four Asian tigers. There was also Chiang's growing paranoia against the United States' influence in his country, which was seen as past usually didn't go so well. Looking at you, World War II. He even conjectured the CIA was intending on coupping him later in his life. He would respond with growing wariness against USA-friendly politicians in his de facto one-party state, having problems taken care of or exiled from the country altogether. This would escalate with the removal of war hero Sun Li-jen, who up until this point was the leader of the Republic of China Army, the renamed NRA, to the ceremonial military advisor to Chiang, removing him from his troops. Then Chiang Ching-kuo, Chiang's son, who was the head of the secret police, added commissars, not unlike the Soviets to the military, which the general opposed in favor of a Western system. He would be arrested, interrogated, and freely admit conspiring with the communist agents. He would be sentenced to house arrest and not released until 1988, where he would go on to die 2 years later. Chiang would live out the rest of his days planning to retake the mainland, though his generals would just give him enough lip service and support he needed to really believe, holding the carrot in front of the rabbit. The fanatical dreamer would die on the 5th of April, 1975 from renal failure after a bout of pneumonia and a heart attack in the preceding months. His body was buried on the island that was his last bastion of hope, though in reality he hoped to be buried back in his birthplace in Fenghua district in Ningbo when the ROC retook the mainland. But all that is a burning memory now. The two men who would define the age of Chinese history were gone. It was up to the successors to either move on their legacies, or maybe Dr. Sun's, or perhaps a new direction would be forged, no? If anything, they should have learned from their forefathers' mistakes and built a better China, not in the name of some dead men, or some ideological fervor, but one for the betterment of the people of China. Han, Hui, Tibetan, Uyghur, Mongol, what have you. It is only through the sins of our past that we may forge a brighter future for us all. And if you learned anything from this long-winded series, remember this. Treat thy fellow man not as the other. Treat them as brother, sister, friend, as a human being. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you in the next one.